Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning, like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Clarke, and I'm here with...
And I'm Rick Gatteau. Judi, it's great to be back with you. So apparently we were renewed for season 3. What do you think of that? That's great. And for our first episode of season 3, we are thrilled to have Andrew Flescher joining us. Andy, we've been a friend, colleague for a long time. And Andy's expertise is focused on morality. And we are going to talk with Andy today about where we learn morality, what defines it, whether it's subjective or objective. And Andy, you are a professor of public health and a professor of English here at Stony Brook University. So we're just, again, honored to have you join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Rick, I've known you all 17 years I've been here. Judi, I've known you since your day one of arrival.
Yes.
You're stalwarts at this university, your leaders, and you've been here through the vicissitudes of change. So, I mean, it's an honor to be able to speak to what has to be characterized as the relevant question of our time, writ large and small.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a great segue, Andy. And obviously, we wanted to bring you on the show anyway, but recently in the news, Donald Trump was interviewed by reporters from the New York Times. I know it was a wide-ranging interview. And one of the questions that was asked, I think, piqued our interest, which has a direct connection to what we want to talk about today. And the question from the reporter asked, do you see any checks on your power on the world stage? Is there anything that could stop you? And Donald Trump's answer was, yeah, there's one thing, my own morality, my own mind. It's the only thing that can stop me. So that really generates the first question. If you want to even unpack that a bit, but also help us define morality.
Right. So very quickly to the first and then to the second and then back to the first. One can see the power and intuition, that after all was the cornerstone of the great moment in Genesis 21:22 where Abraham listened to God and nobody else and didn't end up killing his son Isaac, sacrificed a ram, although that experiment had been replicated to the horror of, successors who actually did end up tragically killing their loved one. The fear in such a statement is that someone is both certain and wrong and not listening to anyone else. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to imagine how that can go off the rails. But there's a substance behind the question to the second part of this is, if morality is not purely subjective, if it's a team sport, if it's a group effort, what is its core and what are the rules by which we play? And there I want to just say right off the bat, my training is in comparative religious ethics. Those are my oldest roots. I went from that to philosophy and religion to now medical ethics and English. I feel like I ended up in the perfect place, especially at this university where I have the best colleagues. But I do want to say that, if I were to identify a core of morality, it's other regard. Now, that's not just me saying so. Let me just give 4 quick examples from religious traditions and then 3 from sort of secular traditions. Judaism, Rabbi Hillel, and this is replicated in the Torah and the Talmud throughout. If I am for myself alone, what am I? If not now, when? I'm paraphrasing. I think he actually said exactly that. In the Christian tradition, Luke 10, the Good Samaritan parable, or in Matthew and Mark, where, the idea is there's nothing better that you can do than to sacrifice for somebody who's in need. Sahih al-Bukhari, the first 6 canonical texts of hadith from the Sunni tradition, anybody that is not for somebody else, it can't possibly be for himself. And then in the Buddhist tradition, the whole notion of karuna, which means compassion, or the anatta doctrine, which is no self, again leads to the other person first and then the self. It's not a symmetrical relation. 3 examples from secular traditions. Kant, the categorical imperative, one of the great moral philosophers from the West. Never act according to that maxim, which you can't at the same time will that it becomes a universal law. So this is the idea of autonomy. You're governed by what's inside, but you're held in check by that test, that procedural test whereby every time you do something, you imagine somebody else in your shoes. Would that be okay? Now, that's going to be problematic for a reason I'll explain in a moment. But also Mill and utilitarianism and other utilitarians, greatest good for the greatest number of people. Again, we're thinking beyond ourselves. And the moral philosopher from the West that I favor, Aristotle, who's governed by, what the virtuous person would do. What are the conditions that would lead to human flourishing? In all three of these cases, it goes back to the other and then the self. So, one of the errors I think Kant made, and one of the tricky things about this is how would you know? The so-called golden rule. I mean, in Kant, to sort of pithily summarize the categorical imperative, thou shalt not make of one's own case an exception, right? Always do unto others as you would do unto yourself, the golden rule. The problem is, how would you know what others need? Whence the platinum rule, do unto others as they would have done unto themselves. And now we're back to question one, which is the question you originally asked. How can we do this alone? There has got to be some mode of inquiring, some mode of excavation where you find out simply by listening what others need. Again, the authority for this is not me just saying so. I would have answered that question from the New York Times reporter a little bit differently. It's listening to others, not just in America, which is the so-called melting pot. I think that's misnamed. We're a mosaic, right? We're different people that come together with hopefully a still existing common denominator, despite an environment of irreconcilable polarization. How do we get anywhere? It's got to start through listening and through accessing all voices.
That leads me to the question of, and you kind of answered it, what makes us moral? And can morality exist without religion or spiritual belief systems?
So my answer, I wrote a book called The Altruistic Species with a colleague of mine, Dan Worthen, who was a psychologist, and we looked at philosophical, religious, psychological, and even biological underpinnings of morality. Richard Dawkins wrote a book before he became one of the Holy Trinity and a great atheist called The Selfish Gene, in which he demonstrated that even at a genetic level, we flourish best if counterintuitively we do things in cooperation. And we looked at seminal thinkers from all four of those disciplines. And to answer your question, Judi, we are self-interest sometimes is opposed to altruism, but self-regard, the circumstances that would lead to our maximal flourishing are best manifest if we're working in cooperation with others. Let me give you a mundane example from public health, really the advent of the entire field of public health. And I just thought of this now. Even on the way over, this wasn't in my mind. The way in which we encountered cholera. It used to be miasma, night air, right? This darkness in the air for which we were being punished that was thought to cause disease. And a guy named Jon Snow, not the heartthrob from Game of Thrones, but the actual historical Jon Snow, who created, sort of the epidemiological imagination, that's Ashton's term, the notion of the germ theory of medicine. He did this by locating a water pump on Broad Street in London. And he created one of the first dot maps, all the locations where there were outbreaks, and they were able to figure out exactly where this pump was. Now, I just want to be clear. This is a result of people whose first and last names were not known to other people with first and last names, but all working together. And this then, was a watershed moment for public health. The same is true of, in my view, vaccination. How we fare depends on what other people are doing, other people we don't know. That's in our self-interest. Now, ideology sometimes gets in the way. But I think fundamentally, you don't need to go to a preachy, knee-jerk, top-down, help others because it's what I'm told to do, right? You don't need to be dogmatic about it. You can, and this is why I favor Aristotle, you can look at what's best for us, look at virtue, look at flourishing. Again, this requires actually knowing. How do you get there?
Yes. Thank you.
I wanted to go back to, you shared, obviously, society we live in now, just incredible polarization. And the intersection between polarization and morality, I wonder, as we think of ourselves in the society we live in, are there still any universal truths that we all hold in common?
So this is a great question. I'm starting to have doubts myself. It is a scary moment. Something recently happened in our country that gave me a flicker of hope. We're edging onto the threshold question, right? When this gets tested, will there be some sort of stopgap that where we can, say, well, we really are American. There really is decency. And then I want to give two examples from history as well, because there's another feature of morality besides other regard that's important, and that is to act. The book I wrote on moral evil really was a treatise on human inaction, right? It's not just knowing and in seeking to know what the other needs, but acting so as to, replenish that person when they're in trouble. We saw a moment of, if not unity, at least a critical mass of consensus that maybe we shouldn't invade Greenland and take it over. It was not the Democrats, but the Republicans in Congress that put a stop to that. That showed me this can happen, right? There is a line that could be crossed for others who in many, many ways don't share your worldview. I think that that's the past tense, the recent past tense. I think we're in the present participle tense with regard to what recently happened in Minnesota. I don't think we should take too lightly the replacement of the person who's in charge of ICE. I think that's another moment where people saw what they saw and didn't like what they see. There are going to be, outliers. There always are. We can tolerate that. We don't need perfection. We need to flourish. I think the proof is in the pudding there. But how about in moments in history, and I'll just take one from the past, where the law of the land and the consensus is what in history, with the historical lens, we regard to be evil. And now I'm thinking about a French village, Les Chambons, in Vichy, France, during, the incursion of the Gestapo into places outside Germany, and the Huguenot community, salt-of-the-earth Protestants who had about 3,000 villagers in this small town next to a forest, harboring 5,000 Jews. More people they saved than actually lived there. The punishment for which was death to them and their families. There's a nod to this in the Quentin Tarantino movie, Inglourious Bastards. The very opening scene, really, I think Tarantino had Les Chambons in mind. These were people who understood that the law of the land violated a larger objective kind of sense. But now they're running in potentially, theoretically, to the same problem that Trump is when he says, I just listen to what's inside. Now, these are 3,000 people listening to what's inside. They're informed by their tradition. The person that wrote the book on them, a guy named Philip Halley, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. It's a reference to a passage in Deuteronomy that says, you are nothing if you don't step up and help these people when nobody else is. How do we know when we have arrived at that moment, which is your question? That is a very, very hard thing to do. Aristotle identifies the features of human flourishing that are cross-cultural, and he did this years ago, and a lot of neo-Aristotelians do this today. Martha Nussbaum, one of my mentors when I was at Brown, talked about things like shelter and play and being fed, kinds of things for which the government has traditionally in this country and elsewhere been known to supply for those that are most vulnerable. I see Oxfam, right? This is an organization with 21 NGOs in about 70 to 90 countries, attending to things like people starving to death, people under conditions of insecurity, people who don't have health care. There is buy-in, cross-cultural buy-in for this. But this is, of course, you're bringing me right back to the 90s when I was in graduate school. This is a, seminal question, and there are really thoughtful, respectable thinkers who doubt much of what we say from a traditional perspective with the evangelical tone with which we say it. I believe in altruism evangelically, saying you're being sold a narrative yourself, like Nietzsche comes to mind. Nietzsche had a lot of thoughtful things to say. The rhetoric of altruism can be used for selfish ends. That was one of Nietzsche's main points. And sometimes we're not even aware we're doing that. That was one of Foucault's points. So, Rick, that is sorry for the long answer, but that is a very tough question.
So to that point, do intentions matter more than outcomes when evaluating moral behavior?
This is the great debate. I apologize for the jargon in advance between deontological thinkers and teleological thinkers. Deontological thinkers think it's about the process. It's a means to getting there. Teleological thinkers think like utilitarians or Aristotelians, the outcome. Telos means end in Greek. Kant, the very last article he wrote was on the supposed right to lie from altruistic motives. So he imagines this scenario in which somebody is at the door who, like a Gestapo type of figure, who's going to kill the person that you're sheltering in your basement. You're not going to do that, but you have good reason to believe he will do that. Knocks on the door and Con asks, are you allowed to tell this person a lie to protect the person in the basement? And Con answers the question, no. And he was accused contemporaneously by his critics of being senile for saying this. They missed Kant's point, which was you only have control over what you do in the purity with which you do it. You can't assume the autonomous perspective of someone else. They have their own autonomy. That does not mean that Kant was in favor of leading to that. And there are all sorts of scenarios, Kant points out, even in that article, in which you could tell the truth and the outcome you fear doesn't come to pass. Utilitarians want Kant to take a reality check and answer the question the other way. My answer to your question is that it's a little of both, obviously. And again, this is one of the reasons I favor Aristotle. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about phronesis, judgment in action. So you need to take everything you know, which is going to be imperfect at the time, think about the reason you're doing something, and be as honest with yourself as you can, with the realization that you're one person and everything at some level is reducible to some sort of myopic thinking. And, there's a world out there and we don't have the luxuries of stepping out of it. So we have to be realistic as well. So another tough question for which I don't have a perfect response.
So Andy, you have obviously studied this for your entire career. I'm curious, how has your thinking about morality evolved over that time?
The more I think, it's such a trite adage, the more you know, the more you don't know. The humility with which I've come to not only see that what I thought might have been true, there's another side to this, but understanding the difficulty of even finding out what that other side is. I'm going to go to another healthcare example. Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian, certainly a consequentialist, who controversially stated that there might be animals that are more intelligent than humans and deserve just as much, if not more, respect than that, obviously got the attention of the variously abled community. They didn't love that because they felt that was denigrating the severely disabled. And a really thoughtful activist, Harriet McBride Johnson, went to Princeton to debate him. And, I think she won the debate. The New Yorker did a big expose on this. It's very rare that someone gets the best of Singer. Singer uses Oxfam, the example I mentioned earlier, in a very powerful article called Famine, Affluence, and Morality from 1972, saying, go to the movies one less time and give that money to charity, and change the world in that, controversial, provocative article. McBride Johnson got the best of him by not only asking him to imagine what the basis for his sense of personhood, which favored cognitive ability, was, but, and this is the point I'm coming to, discussed at length how she actually got from where she was to Princeton, and all the things that no one ever thinks of that were not attended to, like the size of her wheelchair, the mobility of her wheelchair, the problems she had at the airport, the room. I'm reading this with my students this semester. The humility in the moment. I like to think that I'm someone who tries to accommodate people with struggles. Are my PowerPoints doing a good job of that? Are my syllabi doing a good job of that? It is a pain in the neck to go that distance. Half of it is even understanding why what I did in the first place, which seems obviously accessible to me, isn't so accessible. So it is a struggle to actually understand what you don't know. So that's the way in which my thinking has changed. I haven't moved very much on Trump since 2015, but I've moved on a lot of issues pertinent to things that people care about that I never would. I can understand why at Georgetown University you may not want to cover, even though I think this is a bad argument. I can take the perspective of the person who says you may not want to cover birth control, let alone abortion, because that is a violation of the crux of the discipleship upon which this institution was founded. I can understand people who, as a corrective, want to temporarily close the border, even though I'm about as close to an open border guy as you will ever encounter. I can't understand why anyone would make a priority deporting someone who's been in the country 32 years, who's hardworking, that has a family, no matter how they got there. That is a bridge too far. And this leads to a really interesting question that I have for myself and everyone, which is, what do we do about those lingering areas in which, taking the perspective is perhaps giving a podium to a Holocaust denier? Another example from public health, and this is so sadly all too real these days. He said so after we just broke the record for measles cases in South Carolina, beating the prior one in Texas. What do we do about someone who's anti-vax, still, propounding the lies of the Andrew Wakefield scandal, where he doctored data to show that taking MMR vaccine led to autism? This is not my opinion. This is fact. Am I just pulling a Trump right now? This is really tough stuff.
And it leads to, so how do we reconcile individual freedoms with collective moral responsibility?
I'm going to give a Kantian answer. I referred to him earlier. Sure. Kant believed in freedom and autonomy, that we are the choosers and pursuers of our moral actions. There's no surrogates for this. It's up to us. But here's the rub. Every time we do something of this nature, we have to conform what we would do to the moral law. And he uses a capital L in the groundwork of metaphysics of morals in the second critique, the critique of practical reason. It's both. It's existentialism in a sense. You are the agent by which you act, right? You're succumbing to a slavery if you simply act to seek the approbation of others. You are the person who is trying to do the right thing. But in that motion, you're not alone. It's not in a vacuum. Another example I love, I think this is a perfect display of Kantianism, is Camus' The Fall, The Chute. And this is about a guy named Jean-Baptiste. He's a Parisian lawyer, brags about having, walked the blind across the street and giving to charity. And one day he's, after a couple glasses of red wine, he's traversing the Seine and in the story, and here's a splash behind him, and a woman has jumped to her apparent suicide. And he starts to rationalize, I'm not a great swimmer. I'm already across the bridge. She knew what she was doing. And we meet him, the reader, getting drunk in a bar in Amsterdam, falling under the weight of his own self-condemnation. He is unable to escape his own judgment. And he knew in the moment, and he knows it even more starkly in retrospect, he failed to take that opportunity in front of him to act. Now, that is a perfect example of someone who has to be an individual and bear the consequences of their individual action or inaction, but it's because of the world around him that it has meaning. So
yeah,
that's the best I can do.
Oh, that's good.
Well, and actually, this is a good lead into what I wanted to ask next. In life, we always hear the term an ethical or moral dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
Or anybody who's facing that. Mm-hmm. So like bringing this to kind of maybe to our community.
It's a great question.
What's your advice in terms of maybe the framework to use to analyze, to basically assess a dilemma to make what you think is the right decision?
So thank you for that question. I'm about to tiptoe onto a controversial terrain.
Oh, good.
Let the audience know that I'm saying this. I'm speaking in my own voice as a citizen. Rick and Judi are not saying this, and I'm really trying to say this with as much humility that I said we should muster earlier as I can. Let's start with what a dilemma is. It's die too, right? It means one prong of the dilemma is satisfied at the expense of the other. Think of a long division problem with an inconvenient remainder, right? There's no tidying this up. You're going to emerge from this dilemma with a feeling of ambivalence, a feeling of inadequacy. Here's where I become a believer in the mixed message. I don't think it works in some places in life. I wasn't a fan of don't ask, don't tell with regard to gay marriage, but I might be a fan of it, with regard to making a decision where you not only know you're going to, but you embrace the remorse that comes on its heels. Let's go to our earlier example, the Huguenots, right? Philip Halley establishes these are law-abiding citizens. It really pained them, and they talked about their lost virtue, in Halley's account, to break the law. But to not break the law meant people would die. And again, apologies if I'm tiptoeing onto a verboten terrain here. But, we had a Senate meeting at this university, our first Senate meeting, and the question of what protections can we offer students, community members, faculty, staff, and anybody who might be on this public space who fear what ICE might mean. And I think if there's anything we've learned from the last 2 weeks and really since, this year has begun, we don't know the answer to that question. We don't know how far things will go. I optimistically mentioned earlier that maybe there'll be a cooling off period because of what we incontrovertibly saw, but we don't know. And there were some, within the law sorts of suggestions that were raised. I'm going to use the passive voice so as to avoid naming any names. But for example, we could have a hotline at the university to let folks know that ICE was in our presence. We could have a designation of public and private spaces. This is something we could do. And the answer that came back was, we are going to comply with the law. There is no reason to do these things at this time. The dilemma here is how to not put a spotlight on you that's not on you to begin with and put everyone in harm's way versus doing the right thing when things get really dire. And when they get dire, they're going to get dire fast, especially for the vulnerable. What do? It's a dilemma to exactly your question. The first question I would ask, is it hypothetically possible? Like, is there a threshold where one answer has to now give way to the other? Huguenots answer that question, yes. And then how do you do it? How do you know when you've reached the threshold? And I have to revert back earlier to what I said. This is one of the things that's beautiful about the idea of a Senate, of a faculty Senate. I was speaking as a faculty member, but as bodies in which we can speak with our own voices. And I'm emboldened by the knowledge that our current university president was a big senator and head of the senator at her former institution. These are all encouraging signs to say that we will have an environment in which every voice is encouraged to speak up. I'm going to give an action item that is totally non-controversial right now. I believe, and maybe you two can do something about it if it's only to mention this up the chain. I think it's going to be a welcome idea. You've been at Senate meetings. Senate meetings are too short and there's too much business to discuss this. We need a separate meeting, and it needs to be widely advertised that we would like everybody to come, safe space, rules of respect. Rick, I've seen you. Judi, I've seen you moderate fora. I don't think there's anybody on the planet that could do a better job than you two, where people get to speak in their own voice safely. Maybe their suggestion is not adopted, but everybody gets to speak about what they think the answer to this question should be. And then you're here for a reason. You've been here a long time. You're good at your jobs. I trust you. Let's see what comes of this. Let's see. We don't have to have the same answer as this other place. We can have an answer where there is buy-in. And this is one of the key features of procedural justice. Procedural justice specifically puts people in the room who disagree, so that whatever norm is arrived at has less grounds to be challenged in retrospect, because you can go back to the record and see that those voices were accessed. If it's just an elite few, by elite, I don't mean rich necessarily, or, more well-read, or there's all sorts of, micro definitions of elite, but I'm using elite in the sense of just a few versus many. That conclusion, whatever it is more bound for suspicion. So action item for both of you. I think aside from the Senate, where we're pressed for time, we ought to build 3 hours. It doesn't have to be the full 3. I imagine it might be. What should we do about these questions? Just ask the questions. But, the risk here, and this is now I'm back from the non-controversial, tiptoeing back to the controversial. People like to feel as though if they're invited to something, that something will matter. And so it would be nice if whatever conclusion the administration came to, it didn't have that answer already in advance, that answer was informed by what happened in this town hall. I give you both my word. I did not have this town hall idea until I was sitting here right now. I just came up with it. But I think we have to answer the question in light of what everybody has seen with their own eyes. What is reasonable to do if ICE comes to our campus? What can we do? What can we do to be law compliant? We should begin with the idea of a dilemma, because there's not going to be a perfect answer. One prong of the dilemma is going to suffer because the other prong was attempted to be addressed.
And can I ask a follow-up to, you said at the very beginning, one word that stuck with me is about listening. And I'm going to expand on that to say listening to understand. And in the space that you're recommending people to kind of share ideas, share perspectives, that's one frame of it. But how do we get people to then listen to understand?
Are you talking about in this country or at this university?
At the university. Well, in the example that you shared, because some of it's about idea sharing, but it also requires listening.
For sure.
To understand.
Look, we are mere human beings, and we are subject to the circumstances that we inherit. And we have the fortune, this is good luck. My opinion, I've seen, violations of this in isolated moments, but the 17 years of my experience at Stony Brook is such that we do behave, we do listen to one another, and that you would have my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, my imagination is that you'd have at the university, not a town hall, in Port Jefferson or somewhere else, but here at this university, over which, administrators, have dominion to organize this. We could have ground rules for respect. You could invite in advance a number of representatives of their constituents, including the union, including, those most visibly known for protest, to buy into the rules of engagement. And my opinion, I don't have a crystal ball, is that those would be respected. You get that, you get 98% of it. Because the other 2% is the decision that's made inside. You can't have people yelling at each other. There are ways of setting. I'm talking to the masters here. I know less than both of you, but people could not be allowed to ask rhetorical questions, for example, questions to which they already know the answer. Every question one asks has to be a question that one generally doesn't know the answer to. Comments, which are rhetorical questions, could be limited to, there could be a timer. They could be limited. There could be a principle of trying to respect as many voices in the room as possible. So choose your time wisely. I think there's so much to gain here and so little to lose. And I think, again, humbly submitted, my opinion, I could be wrong. It is time to revisit the answer we got about what happens when ICE comes here. Not if. Maybe it's an if. Maybe we'll have the blessing of it being an if, but I think we should be prepared, right? There's another huge benefit here. This is not a dilemma because I think everyone's going to win here. This is win-win. Those who are most vulnerable with regard to the arrival of ICE will feel protected no matter what the outcome. The intention will be on display. Those who might have a view of, there are costs to having an open border, and that's what the mandate, the principal mandate, because of which this president was elected, is there to observe. That population of individuals would be impressed by the way in which this forum was conducted. I commit to helping out. I won't ask a question. I'll just be there to listen, and I will be at your service to help keep the order if required. I am optimistic. We have the blessing. You can't assume this. We all saw the tinderbox, after 2023 in the fall. That might be a little bit more challenging. I don't think this is quite as sensitive as that issue, even though it's closer to home. I think it's doable.
Thank you, Andy. We appreciate the challenge because what we want to do is we want a campus where we model and we give opportunity for voice because everyone matters. Everybody absolutely has a role in creating a sense of belongingness, a sense of safety, and a sense of our community. So we absolutely hope our listeners find these discussions informative and empowering as we navigate these interesting times together. Thank you so much for bringing your incredible wisdom, all the knowledge, the theory, the challenge, the solutions. This is a conversation we will absolutely continue.
So, Andy, thank you so much. Join us again for next week's episode. For now, I'm Rick Gatteau.
And I'm Judi Brown Clarke. Thank you for tuning in.
So grateful to have been here. Thank you.